In the Appalachian Mountains, there are places even the bravest hunters won't enter. Places where the trees lean too close, where the air feels heavier than it should, and where silence presses against your chest like a weight. One such place has a name locals only whisper: Cutter's Hollow. For decades, stories circulated about a single family that lived there. Not stories of ordinary hardship, but of something far stranger. Men who looked almost identical, generation after generation, sons who were indistinguishable from their fathers. Entire bloodlines folding back on themselves until family trees became knots. By the 8th generation, science said they should have collapsed, diseased or infertile. Instead, they grew stronger, taller, stranger. Their DNA became 90% identical, as though they weren't individuals at all, but parts of something greater. What was happening inside that farmhouse wasn't just about inbreeding. It was about obsession, evolution, and something far older than the family itself. Something that had been waiting beneath the mountains all along. Before we dive into this disturbing story, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss future documentaries where forgotten history collides with nightmare reality. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's always wild seeing how far these stories travel. Share this one with a friend too. Trust me, you'll want someone to talk to after hearing what's coming. In the mid-1800s, two brothers walked away from the noise of towns and the judgment of neighbors. Jeremiah and Elias Whitaker carried with them a belief that their blood was sacred, chosen, unbreakable. They were not fleeing persecution. They were answering a call, one only they seemed to hear. To them, isolation meant purity, and purity meant power. The Appalachian Mountains became both their cathedral and their cage. The land they chose was Cutter's Hollow, a valley avoided by hunters and trappers. The trees seemed wrong there, twisted close together, whispering whenever the wind passed. Perfect for secrets. The Whitaker brothers built a farmhouse with their own hands. Rough-hewn timbers, stone foundation, smoke curling into the forest sky. But this was no ordinary home. Every nail, every wall, carried the weight of their covenant. Their pact was spoken beneath candlelight. No outsiders, no dilution. Their blood would fold back into itself, generation after generation, until it became something eternal. They sealed it with silence, and with kinship turned inward. At first, neighbors thought nothing of it. Families in these mountains often kept to themselves. But whispers began when sons looked eerily like their fathers, and cousins mirrored uncles with unsettling precision. By the 3rd generation, resemblance had become more than uncanny. Entire groups of Whitakers could be mistaken for brothers, though some were uncles, others nephews. It was as if time had stopped in their faces. Science says such unions collapse quickly, producing weakness, illness, infertility. Yet the Whitakers seemed to grow stronger. Tall, pale, with identical blue-gray eyes, they moved like reflections, like echoes of one another. Locals passing near the hollow reported strange sights. Rows of Whitaker boys playing in the creek, each face nearly identical. A farmer swore he saw them all turn their heads in perfect unison. The farmhouse itself began to change as the family expanded. Each generation added new rooms, staircases, crooked hallways. The house didn't spread outward naturally. It coiled and folded back upon itself like their bloodline. It grew in ways that unsettled outsiders. A door would open into nothing but stone. A staircase led to a ceiling too low for any man. The house was reflecting the family within. But to the Whitakers, it was home. Sons were raised to believe the hollow protected them, that outsiders carried corruption. They were told purity required sacrifice and loyalty demanded silence. The pact wasn't spoken of beyond those walls. It was lived, enforced in every meal shared, every whispered prayer, every match made between brothers and cousins. To them, it wasn't grotesque. It was destiny. By the fifth generation, the Whitakers no longer bothered explaining themselves. No outsiders were permitted past the tree line. Hunters who wandered too close never returned. Locals called it cursed land, a place God had abandoned. Yet inside, life thrived strangely. Sons were born healthy, their features sharpened, almost sculpted. Extra ribs appeared in some, an additional tooth in others, but none of it weakened them. If anything, they flourished unnaturally. The hollow became more than geography. It became alive in their stories. The brothers told their sons the wind carried voices of ancestors, that the soil remembered every step, that their bloodline was chosen. When Jeremiah grew old, he looked upon his sons and grandsons and saw his own face reflected back countless times. In their sameness, he believed he saw immortality. He died certain the covenant had worked. Elias followed not long after, buried beside his brother in the hollow. Their descendants carried forward the pact with even greater fervor. What began as obsession was becoming something more, something evolution itself hadn't accounted for. The Whitaker farmhouse began as a modest cabin, sturdy but simple, built by Jeremiah and Elias with their own hands. Over time, however, it became something else entirely, twisting into shapes no sane architect designed. Each generation added to the structure, not with careful planning, but with instinct, as though compelled. Rooms sprouted like tumors, staircases coiled upward to nowhere, and doors opened onto walls of solid stone. From the outside, the farmhouse looked like a patchwork of eras, colonial logs, Victorian gables, crude shacks fused together. But from within, it felt alive, like a body continually rebuilding itself with scar tissue. The air inside always seemed heavy, like the walls pressed inward. Some said the timbers groaned, not from age, but as if the house itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling with the family inside. The brothers believed the house reflected their bloodline's purity. They told their sons the house grew in response to them, shaping itself into a mirror of their unity, absorbing their covenant into wood and stone. Visitors who strayed inside never forgot the sensation. Floors slanted in unnatural ways, hallways looped back into themselves, and shadows pooled where no windows existed. The house resisted outsiders as fiercely as the family did. The deeper one walked, the stranger it became. A parlor where sound carried too long, like voices echoing through a cavern. A cellar whose ceiling dripped though no water source existed. It unsettled the unprepared. But to the Whitakers, the house was sanctuary. Sons grew up memorizing every crooked turn and narrow staircase. They slept without fear in rooms outsiders would describe as claustrophobic, finding comfort in its strange design. By the fourth generation, additions came not only for necessity, but ritual. When a new union was sealed, a new room was built. When a son was born, another hallway stretched like a vein. The farmhouse's blueprint became a genealogy. Each board recorded a birth, each stair a union. To leave the house was unthinkable. To expand it was sacred. Their home became a physical archive of their blood. Locals whispered the house was cursed, alive in some unnatural way. Hunters swore they saw its outline change over the years, as if the building shifted shape when no one was watching. In winter, smoke curled from more chimneys than anyone remembered seeing before. In summer, windows multiplied like eyes staring back at the tree line. The farmhouse seemed to grow the way a living organism adapts. The men who lived inside embraced the strangeness. They believed the house was not simply shelter, but an extension of their blood, absorbing their rituals, reflecting their sameness. It became both fortress and identity. Strangers described the smell of the place as overwhelming, metallic, sweet, and rotten at once, like soil mixed with decay. For Whitakers, it was the scent of home, comforting as a father's hand on the shoulder. Those who dared cross the threshold without permission felt watched. They reported eyes glowing faintly in dim corridors, though no lamps burned. They left claiming the house remembered intruders, embedding their presence into its wood. By the seventh generation, the farmhouse sprawled across the hollow like a growth. No one could count its exact number of rooms. Some said it shifted nightly, expanding inward, as though hiding more than walls. It wasn't just architecture. It was ritual incarnate. Every crooked hallway, every leaning chimney, every hidden room testified to the covenant of blood. The Whitakers didn't live inside the house. The house lived inside them. And so Cutter's Hollow gained its legend, not just of men bound by blood, but of a farmhouse that had grown like flesh around bone, waiting for the next generation to add yet another layer. By the late 1980s, the world was shrinking under satellite maps and scientific curiosity. Places once hidden by geography were suddenly visible from above, and Cutter's Hollow could no longer stay completely forgotten. Dr. Eugene Curl, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins, stumbled across fragmented records that didn't make sense. Birth certificates showing impossible parentage, census notes repeating the same surnames over generations, and gaps where outsiders should have appeared. To him, it was irresistible. Curl had studied isolated communities before, but this one was different. The more he read, the more the Whitaker name became tangled, like branches curling back onto themselves unnaturally. He arrived at the hollow in autumn, suitcase packed with research notes, a VHS camcorder, and quiet confidence. He expected a tragic case of inbreeding, something explainable by biology. He believed logic would prevail. From the moment he stepped across the tree line, his certainty wavered. The air was heavy, carrying a metallic sweetness, as if rust and rot lingered. The forest itself seemed to inhale as he passed. The farmhouse loomed ahead, larger than he'd imagined, its shape unnerving. Wings stretched in contradictory directions, roof lines tilted, windows clustered like watchful eyes. He wrote in his journal, "The house looks grown, not built." That first night, he set up his camera in a makeshift lab inside the farmhouse. His voice trembled as he whispered, "If you're watching this later, it means I didn't make it out." Floorboards groaned under his weight, not from age but rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. At times he thought he felt the house adjusting around him, as though it recognized him as an intruder. Stranger still were the sounds. Wet, clicking noises echoed through the night, sometimes distant, sometimes just beyond his door. He told himself it was rodents, maybe faulty pipes, but the noises seemed purposeful. Days turned into a blur of uneasy exploration. Curley collected blood samples from Whitaker men, cataloged genealogical charts, and began to realize the truth. Their DNA similarity wasn't high. It was impossible, 90% identical. For comparison, identical twins share about 100%. First cousins perhaps 12.5%. But here, across multiple generations, cousins, fathers, and sons were nearly genetic copies. The numbers defied every expectation of biology. It frightened him. He whispered into his camcorder, "This isn't inbreeding anymore. This is something else." Behind him, the shadows stretched wrong, as though the house itself leaned closer, listening to his confession. The tape ended in static. The more he tested, the more bizarre it became. When he sedated a teenage boy for examination, his father collapsed in another room simultaneously. When he drew blood from one, another bled spontaneously. It wasn't just similarity. It was connection. They weren't separate individuals anymore. They were linked by something unseen, functioning as one body spread across many hosts. Curl's scientific language crumbled beneath what he was witnessing. He scribbled frantically, "Hive? No, not quite. More than that. They are one organism stretched thin." His notes shifted from neat diagrams to jagged handwriting, the record of a man teetering on the edge. At night, he heard voices, not from the Whitakers but from the walls themselves, whispering in unison. Sometimes they echoed his own words back to him, as if mocking, as if already inside his thoughts. On November 11th, at 3:47 a.m., his camera caught something pale slipping behind him. Too long-limbed, joints bending wrong. His final words on tape, "They're coming." Then the screen fell sideways into static silence. Dr. Eugene Curl vanished into Cutter's Hollow, consumed like so many before him. But his scattered notes, scratched tapes, and unfinished charts remained, warning that what thrived in the farmhouse was beyond science or faith. When investigators finally entered Cutter's Hollow after Curl's disappearance, they expected rot, dust, and abandonment. Instead, they found photographs, journals, and a family history captured in eerie portraits lining the crooked walls of the farmhouse. Early daguerreotypes showed Jeremiah and Elias Whitaker standing shoulder to shoulder. Their resemblance was uncanny, like twins rather than brothers. Decades of photographs followed, and each generation blurred into sameness until individuality seemed erased completely. By the mid-1900s, the family looked less like relatives and more like replicas. Sons mirrored fathers with impossible precision. In one photograph, 15 men stood together, their faces nearly indistinguishable, like one man copied many times. But the real horror wasn't in the pictures. It was in the medical notes left behind. Charts recorded bones bending in directions they shouldn't, nervous systems seemingly connected across multiple men, and organs unexplainably misplaced. Curl's final scribbles suggested something terrifying. The Whitakers were no longer a family at all. They were a single organism, consciousness stretched across dozens of bodies, their bloodline spiraling into uniformity instead of collapse. Investigators discovered a room that seemed like a nursery. 7 cribs lined the wall, each labeled with biblical names. But the true nightmare covered the walls, thousands of 6-fingered handprints pressed into still wet paint. The handprints were all identical in size, not children's marks, but something that had stopped growing generations earlier. They trailed upward toward the ceiling, as though countless identical hands had climbed into darkness above. In another hallway, mirrors reflected faces that weren't their own. Investigators swore they saw their cheekbones sharpen, their eyes pale. The hollow wasn't just holding the Whitakers anymore, it was reshaping anyone who lingered inside. One officer described hearing voices layered together, speaking from the walls. "Welcome home, outsiders." It wasn't just mimicry. It was invitation. The house didn't see them as strangers. It saw them as unfinished additions. The Whitakers themselves rarely appeared, but their presence was undeniable. Pale shapes stood at the tree line, watching with stillness too complete. When spotted, they dissolved into shadow, as if the forest absorbed them willingly. Evidence piled higher. Synchronized collapses when one was harmed, bleeding that spread across multiple bodies, identical DNA samples registering 90% overlap across every living member. They weren't individuals anymore, they were a shared consciousness. Local rumors became vindicated. The stories of men moving in perfect unison, of whispers carrying across the woods, were no exaggerations. They were fragments of truth, pieces of a puzzle outsiders weren't meant to complete. By the 8th generation, what remained of individuality dissolved almost entirely. Men moved together, eyes pale, limbs sometimes bending in unnatural ways. They were evolution reborn, a hive mind wrapped in human shapes. The farmhouse itself reflected this unity. Rooms no longer corresponded to logic or need. They felt like organs, veins, chambers, passageways of a living body. To enter was to step inside something far beyond architecture. Photographs from the 1960s showed elongated figures, their features sharpening toward something inhuman. Cheekbones too narrow, fingers too many. By the final Polaroids, the men looked like identical shadows of one another, uncanny and unnatural. A phrase scratched onto the back of one photograph chilled investigators. The 9th generation. It suggested something was coming, not yet complete. The family wasn't finished evolving. They were waiting for the next stage. The revelation was unbearable. Cutter's Hollow wasn't just a tale of inbreeding. It was a glimpse of something beyond human, a bloodline collapsing into singularity, waiting for its ultimate form. One body, many skins, eternal. Those who left the farmhouse carried the memory like poison. They knew the Hollow's silence was temporary. The ninth generation was stirring, and soon, what whispered beneath the mountains would no longer remain contained. By dawn, Cutter's Hollow was no longer just local folklore. The farmhouse had drawn the attention of state police, federal agents, and scientists in hazmat suits. Quarantine lines were drawn, floodlights turned night into false day. From the outside, the farmhouse looked wrong, as though it had grown overnight. New extensions bulged from its frame, walls pulsed faintly like breathing skin, and windows shifted position when no one was watching. Thermal cameras revealed something more disturbing. Heat signatures weren't stationary within the house. They pulsed like blood, circulating between rooms. The farmhouse wasn't shelter anymore. It was alive, responding to the presence of intruders outside. Detective Ray Morrison sat inside a sterile tent, recounting what he'd witnessed with shaking hands. His words described six-fingered handprints, photographs of identical generations, and pale shapes that bent joints in impossible, inhuman ways. Dr. Nathan Vance, the CDC's lead geneticist, studied the evidence grimly. Blood samples taken from Whitaker men showed DNA rewriting itself in real time. Segments weren't mutating randomly. They were reorganizing with purpose, as though guided by intention. "This isn't inbreeding," Vance whispered. "It's replication." His colleagues exchanged nervous glances. They weren't studying a family anymore. They were confronting something that blurred the line between biology and infection. A living code spreading silently through air itself. Containment seemed possible until the first breach came from within. A medic collapsed in the quarantine tent, screaming as his spine twisted, bones bending at unnatural angles. His hand split open, revealing a budding sixth finger. Within minutes, several others displayed the same changes. Their veins glowed faintly beneath the skin, spreading in branching patterns like roots. Masks, filters, and gloves offered no defense. The spores had already invaded their bodies. Radios crackled uselessly. Compasses spun in circles. Instruments bent beneath the weight of the hum. Some soldiers clutched their ears and screamed, but others dropped their weapons, staring wide-eyed as if hypnotized by unseen command. Morrison watched helplessly as men deserted the barricades and walked toward the hollow. They didn't scream or resist. They vanished silently into pale arms stretched outward, welcomed as though they had always belonged there. For every Whitaker body struck down by bullets, another rose unnaturally from the soil. They weren't dying in any human sense. They were multiplying, each fallen vessel reabsorbed and reborn in perfect synchrony. Inside the farmhouse, time fractured. Investigators swore 30 minutes passed, but radios outside insisted they'd been gone 3 days. The hollow wasn't obeying natural law. It was bending reality itself, rewriting time like strands of DNA. Those already infected began to change. Their faces sharpened, skin paling, irises glowing faintly. When they spoke, their voices carried an unnatural echo, layered with tones not their own. The transformation wasn't infection. It was assimilation. The hollow's intent was clear: expansion. It didn't want secrecy anymore. It wanted to spread outward, consuming soldiers, scientists, and strangers until every outsider became another vessel, another identical voice in the growing hive. The quarantine line collapsed in hours. Barricades were meaningless against whispers in the air, spores that slipped through filters, and men who willingly walked into the hollow's embrace. Resistance fractured into fear and silence. Ray Morrison realized too late the truth. Cutter's Hollow had never been trapped. It had been waiting, preparing through generations. And now, with the 9th generation awakening, nothing outside its borders would remain untouched. Ray Morrison thought the danger stood at the tree line, but the truth was far closer. The real infection had already taken root inside him, buried deep within his own blood. He couldn't escape himself. Dr. Nathan Vance showed him the data with a trembling hand. Segments of Whitaker DNA already threaded through Ray's genome, markers no outsider should carry. His grandmother had fled the Hollow long ago, but never completely. Ray wasn't just an investigator. He was a bridge. The Whitakers had been waiting generations for his return, and the 9th generation would not begin with them. It would begin with him. The revelation explained everything. The way the house seemed to breathe with him, the humming inside his chest, the strange pull that brought him back even when terror screamed to run. Blood remembers its home. Curl had tried and failed. But Ray carried Whitaker blood, laced with resistance. He wasn't just vulnerable. He was uniquely capable. The only prison strong enough to hold the hive was the one it already called. The farmhouse pulsed ahead, its walls flexing like muscle. Windows wept condensation like sweat. Veins of glowing mold traced along its frame, spreading outward into the soil, merging land and structure into one vast organism. Ray stepped inside, clutching Curly's notes. The walls breathed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Voices surged in his skull, thousands at once. Join us. Become whole. We are you. You are us. He whispered a prayer. Not to God, but to his ancestor, Mary Whitaker, the man who escaped long ago. If someone has to be the prison, let it be me. The hive answered eagerly. Pale hands reached for him, not to strike, but to embrace. Their touch wasn't violent. It was welcoming, tender, the way brothers might gather a lost sibling into the fold. The moment Ray surrendered, agony ripped through him. Light lanced into his veins, skin glowing translucent. Faces pressed beneath his flesh, countless Whitaker men screaming, whispering, begging, laughing, all inside him at once, clamoring for release. For a moment he felt himself dissolving, individuality vanishing beneath overwhelming unity. But then the resistance flared, a spark passed down from his ancestor. It burned like fire, carving a fragile island of self. The Whitakers poured into him, generation after generation, until the farmhouse groaned and collapsed. Walls splintered inward, swallowed into soil. The hollow exhaled as though relieved, its voices funneled into the single vessel of Ray. When dawn rose, Cutter's Hollow was sealed. Officials declared toxic contamination, fenced the valley, and buried the truth beneath bureaucracy. But inside a fortified chamber, Ray Morrison lay alive, transformed into something no man had ever been. His skin shimmered translucent, faint shadows of countless faces shifting beneath. Scientists recorded brain activity like galaxies flickering, thousands of separate consciousnesses fighting for dominance inside one man. Yet somehow, impossibly, Ray held them contained. He had become what Curl could not. The prison of souls, a living cage for an alien hive that once threatened to consume the world. His individuality was the thin wall holding back eternity. But Ray knew he was dying. His body couldn't withstand the strain forever. Already whispers bled through him at night, murmurs of unity, of surrender, of a day when his fragile resistance would break. Cutter's Hollow might have burned, but the spores weren't gone. Some had escaped, carried quietly on wind or in bloodlines. And in distant towns, whispers began again, children born pale-eyed, dreaming voices older than mountains. The Whitakers believed their blood would make them eternal. In a way, they were right. But their legacy wasn't unity. It was Ray Morrison, the man who chose to remain separate so humanity could survive.